I went to the wrong place. So let me begin. This is, for me, the most fascinating thing I've ever done. Partly the timing is very good, but also because what's happening is quite spectacular. If you looked in yesterday's New York Times, you would have seen an article about the fact that Russia's having some trouble with the fact that oil prices are dropping. So my wife says to me, "Your book's obsolete." I said, "No, not quite yet." But it certainly is a time of very dynamic change. And I'm going to do something that authors, when they do it, and I'm listening, I hate, but I'm going to do it anyway. I'm going to read to you, not just a little bit, not the whole thing, but I'm going to read the first page. I used an agent for the first time in my life. I've never done that before. And she said, "You know, you're doing something different. You're not writing a textbook, and you can't tell your students that they'd better read it because they're going to be tested on it. When you have a general audience, you'd like to do that, but you can't do it. So you've got to make it so they want to read it." I said, "Well, if I do that, I'll lose my license as an economist." But she said, "Do it anyway." So what to say, how to handle that? Well, as you heard, I've had a chance to participate in a group that ultimately ends up meeting with Putin, which is quite an unusual opportunity. But before that, it's called the Valdai Hills Discussion Group, which is organized by Novosti Press Agency in an effort to brainwash critics. And you can judge for yourself whether they've done that with me. But they invite us to Russia, and they take us around. And this particular year, they were taking us out to the oil fields. The theme was energy. So I told my agent, "Well, I'm going out to Siberia, to the Priobskaya oil field. Maybe I'll find something there." So they took us out there, but it was interesting, but I would really have had to stretch to try to make it jazzy to begin. But then they also took us to the Gazprom headquarters. For those of you who've been in Moscow, Gazprom has this giant skyscraper or office building, partly glass, in the southwest part of Moscow. It stands alone. When you're in there, you can't miss it. And I went into this building and I said, "Well, maybe here I've got something." And in particular, because I began to fantasize. Maybe that's what economists do all the time, but in this particular case, it was an unusual kind of fantasy, and you'll hear, let me just read it and stop talking. Anyway, it begins, "The author is James Bond," so there's the fantasy. I mean, at first I was puzzled. Where were they taking us? For such a big, sleek, glass Moscow high-rise, Gazprom's elevator in its headquarters building was tiny. 5 people could barely squeeze in, and its hall corridors narrow. Here's this big building and this small elevator, narrow corridors. This was, after all, the world's largest producer of natural gas, not to mention Russia's largest company. Following a short walk, we were ushered into a darkened, silent room where nothing seemed to be happening. It was a room something like this, except it was dark, and there was just a big wall here. Strange, strange. It was only when all the members of our group had made their way up on the elevators that the room suddenly came alive. Then, for a time, I felt as if I'd wandered into a NASA Space Center. Or was it a James Bond movie set? All that was missing was that out-of-body voice intoning, "Welcome, Mr. Goldman. We were expecting you." You know, if you've seen James. So here's this big wall behind me. In front of me, where you're sitting, covering the whole 100-foot wall of the room, was a map with a spider web-like maze of natural gas pipelines reaching from East Siberia west to the Atlantic Ocean, and from the Arctic Ocean south to the Caspian and Black Seas. Manipulating this display were Gazprom dispatchers, 3 men controlling the flow of Gazprom's gas to East and West European consumers of this Russian natural gas monopoly. No wonder there was such tight security. And the lights were blinking. You could see where the gas pipelines were going and where the gas was moving. There was also a sense of self-assurance, as measured by the value of its corporate stock by the summer of 2006 when we were there. Gazprom, the state-dominated joint stock corporation, until 1992, it was actually the Soviet Ministry of the Gas Industry, had become the world's 3rd largest corporation. Only private shareholder-owned ExxonMobil and General Electric were larger. One more sentence. With a flick of a switch, those dispatchers sitting in this Moscow room could freeze and indeed have frozen entire countries. At the very least, they could send their citizens off in a panic in search of sweaters, scarves, and blankets. And then to top it off, I managed to find a picture of that dispatching room here with the maps and all this. I mean, it's just incredibly exotic, and you had the sense of very real power. Now, I read that to give you this feeling of immense power. And if you remember, just a decade earlier, not then, it was even less, only 8 years earlier than that, but just August 17th, 1998, was when the Russian stock market collapsed and Russia defaulted on its debt. The country was basically broke. It had ramifications here. You remember some American Bankers Trust, for example, had a write-off $200 million. Long-term capital management in Greenwich, Connecticut was about to collapse, and the Federal Reserve Bank had to step in. It's particularly interesting today because it's déjà vu. The Federal Reserve Bank again is having to step in for this kind of thing. But this was in 1998 something that came really out of Moscow, and they were broke. The Treasury had a few $1 million, but not much more than that. So this is what happens. The country really is falling apart. Now, I don't know, there were some handouts. I don't know if you got, did anybody get any handouts? She was going to hand them out. Do you know where she went? Oh my. Well, it was to be handed out before, not after the lecture. Well, nobody's going to be able to see this, but anyway, let me try until it comes, because this is, you can see a white piece of paper that's about as much as I think you can see. This is from 1992 to 1997, where there's a slight uptick, and then there's 1998. This shows the GDP of Russia. The dark is the GDP. Oil production is the lighter thing, and you can see it's all down. It's dropping. The GDP was dropping by as much as 16% a year. If you accumulate the whole thing, Russia at that point was worse than the Great Depression we suffered in the 1930s. And what is significant about all that is that after the collapse, this is 1998. Do you know where those handouts are?
Yours back still?
Or did I end up taking them all? That doesn't help. Sorry about that. Well, not only am I late, but I'm a goofball, so what are you going to... Anyway, there may not be enough for everybody, so if you may have to share. But those of you who get it, you can see just how dramatic the collapse in the Yeltsin years was, with a slight uptick, again, and I say 1997. Well, the important thing is that after 1998, in August 1999, Yeltsin appoints Vladimir Putin as the prime minister. And so this is 1999, and look what happens. It just completely turns around this way. So it's just the opposite of what had been happening before. So at the end of this period, at least until a month ago, Russia had turned around. The cumulative growth here, it's growing 7-8% a year for 10 years, for the decade, and if you accumulate that, that comes to a doubling of the GDP. So during his 10 years in office, basically, or basically 8 years, but 8.5 years, under Putin, the Russian economy has just reversed itself and has become very prosperous. Russia is basically back. And it all happened on Putin's watch. The other thing, of course, is to see just the contrast before Putin and after Putin, when this is all taking place. So you can understand why the polls will show that, the public opinion polls will show that Putin has a public support rating of 70 to 80%. Now, so the question is, what I'm going to try to address in the lecture, would Russia be any different if Putin had not been the prime minister, and then in January 2000 had been made the provisional president and then won the election in March 2000? Would any of this have been different? Would Russia have been different if without him? Now, I have lectured long enough in my life to know at the beginning of the lecture everybody's awake. I mean, look around, nobody's sleeping. By the middle of the lecture, don't look around. There'll be several people sleeping. By the end of the lecture, other people, when's he going to finish? Let's get out of here. So I'll tell you the answer now. So when you go home, you'll know, what did he say? Everybody will know, whereas usually at the end of the lecture, I'm not sure what he said. Well, anyway, the answer is, without Putin, this country still would have grown. And the reason, of course, is that oil prices went from about $10 a barrel until July, when they were almost $150 a barrel. I tell my wife that if I had been the president, the prime minister, and then the president of Russia, under those circumstances, even I would have been able to have turned Russia around. She doubts it, but with the prices going that high, that fast, it's clear that this made an enormous difference. So what did Putin do? Well, it turns out Putin did make a big difference, and that's what I want to talk about. So yes, I give him credit for it, but it's the oil prices that make the difference. The other thing to notice, if you've got those tables, if you look, you'll see it's a lighter line. By the time it's been copied, it's not pure white anymore. But that's the other line that's going on there is oil production, physical oil production, barrels, tons, as the Russians would use. And you can see, again, without fail, when oil production drops, GDP drops. Without fail, when oil production goes up, GDP goes up. This is because Russia is a mono economy. A monoculture, basically. It's very heavily dependent on oil and gas, for that matter. Now, and if they don't go up the same percentage near the end when they're going up, but if you took price change, in other words, talked about total revenue earned from exports or production of oil, then they would approximate much closer. So you can see the role of oil. It's oil that makes the difference. It's gas that makes the difference. That's why this is called Petrostate. Again, my wife said, you're making a mistake. People think it's prostate. It's not prostate. Again, it's this difference that occurs here. And so what happens is that Putin is there while he's just blessed, in the sense that he comes in, oil prices start to go up. He leaves, and oil prices start to go down. And that raises some other questions that I'll try to get into near the end of the talk, because this suggests that Medvedev, who's taken over as the president now, has ushered in a low-price regime. Now, of course, you could make the argument, well, did Putin cause the oil prices to increase? No. Obviously, he didn't. But he's there, and he's able to take advantage of it. So he leaves oil prices go down, and this suggests that down the road, particularly if people begin to attribute all the problems that Russia may have because of lower oil prices, but that Putin may bring him back. He was our savior. We need him for this particular purpose. So what did Putin do to contribute this? Well, Putin, you know his background. He was trained as a lawyer at Leningrad University. He then went and he joined the KGB, was ultimately ended up in East Germany, and he worked there until the Berlin Wall came down, at which point he was jobless. When they united with West Germany, the West Germans threw out the KGB headquarters, and so he went back to Leningrad. It was still Leningrad, and then he was hired by his former one of his former law professors, a man by the name of Sobchak, to be the deputy governor under Sobchak. What you had, of course, traditionally in the Soviet Union was the deputy governor was in charge of foreign visitors, keeping an eye on them, and usually it was the KGB agent. And so that was a natural position for Putin. So he served in that function in the governor's office. Then, of course, Sobchak lost the election, and so Putin was jobless once more. Along the way, in the middle, he began to ponder, what could Russia do to come back? How could Russia erase what's going on here? in this chaos. And he thought long and hard about it, and he decided that the only thing Russia could do to bring itself back, it had lost its superpower status because with the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia was no longer as strong, and there was with disarmament. So the whole idea of the arms race was off, and nuclear weapons were kind of put in storage. And so Russia still had nuclear weapons, but it was no longer considered a superpower. It was broke, so it couldn't do that. So he began to think what to do, and he came to the conclusion that Russia should take its raw materials, particularly its oil and gas, but it had other valuable ferrous and non-ferrous metals, and use them to move forward. And to do this, he would create what he came to call national champions. Russia began the process of privatization in 1991, and in a sense, he would create these national champions. He would take some of these companies and basically bring them in again as state entities, either officially or with lots of pressure to make them carry out the will of the state, to act on behalf of the state. So he wrote something equivalent to, was a little bit more than a master's degree thesis, but not quite a PhD degree thesis, while he was there. And we've had copies of it. I mean, this is for real now. We've seen it and gone through it, and indeed he spells this out. There is one mention in there of a study prepared by two professors from Pittsburgh University. And it turns out that then somebody went and looked at what these professors had written. Putin, of course, is doing this all in Russian, but because this book had been translated into Russian, the professors from Pittsburgh's book had been translated into Russian, and they went and they looked at the Russian version, and they looked at what Putin wrote, and of course it turns out he took 10 to 15 pages verbatim from that. That's how the next time you see Putin, you say, did you really plagiarize these guys? Because there's really only one. He doesn't say take the whole, but you ask. I'm not going to do that. Anyway, the point is, this is incorporated in what he does, and he carries this out. If you look at it's the third page, actually. They're not put together. This one, it says, Vladimir Putin elected president in 2000, March 2000. He quickly begins to purge to create national champions. And he's elected in March, formally. And you see, you go down to Chernomyrdin, who had been the prime minister, but who, when he was removed as prime minister, was made the chairman of Gazprom. Gazprom, this company that we went to visit, that was the former ministry of the gas industry. Chernomyrdin had actually been the minister of the gas industry, the ministry of the gas industry, before he became the deputy prime minister and then the prime minister. But he's stripping assets. Now that he's in there, he's beginning to strip assets. Stripping assets, taking them out and putting them into another company, one of which was called Itera. Now you go down to the fourth name down here as well, Rem Vyakharev. Vyakharev had been the CEO of Gazprom. He's removed the following year in May, because he and Chernomyrdin together are stripping assets. And this firm Itera is a very opaque kind of company. We don't know who exactly the owners are, but as best we can gather, they're the children of the executives of Gazprom, the wives of some of the executives, and the mistresses of some of the executives. It's a very compatible range. But the most interesting thing is that where is Itera headquartered? It's headquartered in Jacksonville, Florida. Why Jacksonville, Florida? Why not? It's warmer there than Moscow, and besides, it's out of the range. So it's sitting there operating in Jacksonville. And what does any red-blooded energy company do once you begin to operate in the United States, whether you're local, indigenous, or you're foreign? You get yourself a lobbyist. So Itera went out and got itself a lobbyist. Just by chance, they paid her a $300,000 retainer. Just by chance, only coincidence, her father happened to be a U.S. congressman by the name of Kurt Weldon from outside Philadelphia. And Kurt Weldon then becomes, in effect, a man from Itera. He's also a specialist in arms control, but I'm going to focus instead on his energy interests. He invites the executives from Itera to come to Washington, has a reception for them in the Library of Congress. He goes to Jacksonville, even though that not quite his district, to help them inaugurate their new headquarters. And he arranges for the U.S. Trade and Development Commission to give them an $800,000 grant to help them explore for natural gas in Russia. Again, something that's normally not the purview of the U.S. Trade and Development Commission. Again, it's just buying up what energy companies have done traditionally. This kind of support. You also may remember Tom DeLay from Texas. As far as I know, he was not involved with ITER. He was involved with a Russian company called Naftasib. So he too was on the take from the Russian companies come, they watch what American companies do. Let's do the same thing. The point is, the Russians were operating this way, and we're beginning to corrupt the whole system. So ITER then begins to develop this way, and these national champions Putin is taking them back because he resents the stripping of assets, and he wants these national champions to carry out the state's will. And sure enough, when in the year 2000, when Putin becomes the president, the share of the oil production coming from state companies is 10%. It used to be 100%, of course. By the time of 2008, it's back up to 50% again. So he's kind of regathering in the hands of these companies these kinds of assets and doing this kind of thing. And in the meantime, also Putin begins to put his people in positions of power. So go to the sorry about that. Go to the second page where you see the Silovikian business. Silo means strength. The Siloviki are called, what the best way we could translate it would be the law and order types. It would be in this country when you retire from the FBI, you go as a group to work for energy companies or important companies, General Dynamics, or from the Pentagon or from the CIA. So there's what do you do with a retired Pentagon general? Well, usually he goes double dips, and he goes and works this kind of way. This is the same kind of thing that was going on here. And Putin begins to purge, as he's purging the first echelon of oligarchs. If on that other page we just looked at, he got rid of Gusinski, he got rid of Berezovsky, he got rid of Khodorkovsky. The bottom one, of course, Yukos. The notorious case in 2003. Yukos's assets are given to Rosneft. So go back here about the middle of the first of the Silovikian business. You can see the name Igor Sechin. If you look down the bottom, you see the star. He was a former member of the KGB. He worked with Putin in St. Petersburg. Putin, when he comes to Moscow, brings with him his cohort, his buddies, and he begins to give them patronage. He pushes out the old oligarchs, brings in again a second echelon of oligarchs, and you can see the kinds of position they're here. Go up to the fifth name, Dmitry Medvedev. Medvedev had worked with Putin in St. Petersburg. When Putin goes to Moscow, he brings Medvedev down with him. He becomes the chief of the Kremlin administration, and then ultimately, of course, he's Russia's president of Russia today, and along the way he becomes chairman of Gazprom until he becomes the president, and then there's a kind of a musical chair, and one of the other people comes in, let's see if I've got his name on here, takes over as the chairman now of Gazprom. So it's all in the family in that sense. And so Putin has all these people that he's passing out goodies, and they become, I say, the second echelon of oligarchs. Then go down to the bottom, and where they're princelings. This is what the Chinese call the children of the Politburo members who go and pick up jobs in industry, work particularly for companies that are trading with China. And you can see what's happening here. This did not happen in the Soviet era. The children of the Politburo members usually went into think tanks, academic life. Here, the governor of St. Petersburg, her son's working for Veneshtorg Bank. Go down to the bottom. That's probably the best illustration. Patrushev, who was was the head of the KGB until just a government shakeup until now. Two sons. One works for Veneshtorg Bank, and the other is working for an advisor or an assistant to the head of Rosneft. Rosneft, the company that I've just been talking about again. Rosneft, that oil company where they're all there. So what happens is that you get these people coming in, taking over, going in the family business. Gazprom begins, as oil prices go up, as energy prices go up, on Putin's watch, Gazprom's capitalized value, they add up the value of all the stock of Gazprom. When he comes in 2000, the total value of Gazprom stock is $9 billion. As June of this year, you'll hear what's happened since in a second, but in June last year, it had risen from $9 billion to about $350 billion. Some of you, I suspect, are here because you want to know what happened to the stock that you bought from Gazprom, because it went up so. I mean, this was American hedge funds were buying that security because it was one of the fastest rising, and it looked like it was doing very well. But then, as I say, today, it's fallen to $120 billion. So from $9 billion in 2000 to $350 billion in the beginning of the summer, to today's collapse, to 120. As I read in the book, it had the third largest capitalized value after ExxonMobil and then General Electric. Today, because of this collapse, it's 13th. So it's already, Gazprom has fallen in the ranks this way. So you've got this kind of incredible change that's been taking place with riches falling to Putin's friends. It pays to be a friend of Putin because you're going to benefit. There are also rumors about Putin himself. I did not put it in the book because my editor said you don't have documentary proof. I do not have documentary proof, but there are rumors that Putin himself has gotten large quantities of Gazprom stock, maybe $5 billion worth at least, until this collapse. So the odds are, if he doesn't have Gazprom stock, some of his other friends are very closely involved in energy companies, particularly a company called Gunvar, where the owner of the company is his next door neighbor in St. Petersburg, and they're kind of the Dacha district, and he's there, and the feeling is that he's benefited because his friend has directed stock in his direction. Okay, so that in itself is intrinsically interesting as far as I'm concerned. But turn to the last page, which I hope is readable. Europe's reliance on Russian gas. I had been giving lectures about energy before, and I'd heard rumors, but I hadn't any statistics to show that Russia was playing an increasingly large role in supplying energy to the European countries. And so I finally said, well, go check it out. So I went to Littauer Library at Harvard and dug up the International Energy Agency's handbooks and got the different figures for how much energy and what percentage of energy, I calculated what percentage of energy or what percentage of gas was coming from Russia to these different countries. I went back and I put this table together. I had it all, just individual countries before, but then you put it down together, and I saw this, I was, oh my God, this is really something that is sensational, really sensational, and I should write a book about it, and that's really what provoked me to do it. Look here, take the last column on the right. Look at Germany. Look at Europe, for that matter. 31% of its imports come from Russia. Germany, 42%. And the total consumption, 39%. Total consumption for Europe's not that high. But you go down the list and you can see, how could Austria be 135%? Well, statistics, but because they import, they export more than they consume, but they're importing large quantities this way, but then they re-export it. But look at even Italy receives a large quantity, and then you go down to the Eastern European countries, and it's 100%. Now, that's terribly significant because With oil, if there's an embargo on the export of oil, as there was in 1973, when the OPEC countries did that, that's a problem. It causes difficulties. We have gas lines, oil prices go up, but we can still get oil because if we can't get it from Iran or the OPEC countries, there's still other countries out there that we're producing, including Russia, where we could get it from. So a little inconvenience, but and higher prices, and maybe a recession or two, but we can get access to it. Gas is different. Gas is different because it comes at this point only from the pipelines, it's just a lifeline, and you take that lifeline away, an umbilical cord. You take it away, and there's nothing there. Now, it's true, the gas pipeline in Europe that these people have at Gazprom also takes gas from Algeria, takes gas from the North Sea, but those supplies are being depleted. And most of the new supplies are going to come from Russia. And if you're on the eastern end of that pipeline, if you're at this end of the pipeline, then you're as Germany is, then you're very heavily dependent on Russia. And by the time it comes from Algeria, there's not much left. So it's that pipeline, the gas pipeline, gives you a political clout that far surpasses the influence that would come just from prices. So Russia does very well in terms of generating export revenue from oil, because the gas is not that expensive, but the gas gives them the political clout that you sense when you go up into Gazprom headquarters and you see those dispatchers with that kind of power. And it's that is reflected in this table, and it shows you just how influential Russia is now. And if you're Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany now, and you see these figures, and you have to know about those figures, you understand that there's no sense riling the Russians over an issue that's not important to the well-being of Germany. And so you can understand why Angela Merkel now, even though she's tough and comes from East Germany and was really regarded initially as being very strongly opposed and would be tough dealing with the Russians, while she seems now to be a pussycat. And when it comes to whether should Ukraine and Georgia be admitted to NATO, she's been opposed to it. And maybe she should be opposed, maybe we should be opposed to it too, but this is a complete change in her attitude, reflecting, I think, the realization that they are really being held hostage. And indeed, in 2006, in January, when the Ukrainians cut back the gas that was coming through from Russia to them, they cut back to Germany, and the Germans really experienced what could happen. It happened subsequently as well when the Belarusians did much the same kind of thing. So that's basically what the book is about. Now, let me just say a few words about what's been happening within the last couple weeks, because it's quite different, and things change so quickly. When Putin went out after Khodorkovsky, there was good reason for it. Khodorkovsky was quite arrogant. He indicated that he was going to run for president after Putin's term expired. He boasted that he controlled 100 votes in the Duma, and he helped defeat a proposal to raise taxes. He did a variety of things that were... He insulted and accused one of Putin's buddies of corruption. Just the whole thing, because I'm led to believe that he had a net worth of about $15 billion. I'm led to believe when you have that much money, it's pretty easy to be arrogant. Again, it's not something I've experienced personally, but I'd like to try it at some point. Anyway, there we are. So he what does he do? He has Khodorkovsky arrested. There's a kind of a rigged jury trial. Company is declared bankrupt because it hasn't paid its taxes. And there was some justification there for these accusations. In any case, Khodorkovsky is sentenced to prison in Siberia. He's still serving his term. Yukos is dismantled. The assets are taken over by Rosneft, that same company again. And Russia goes on. Yukos may be broken up, but there's not many waves created. Now, just a few weeks ago, Putin began to do something similar. Russia has been hurt by inflation Inflation now is about 14%. And the Russians are nervous about inflation. They have a terribly bad bout of it in the early 90s. Was something like prices went up 26-fold, not 26%, but 26 times. So it basically wiped out savings. It was catastrophic. So they're very nervous about this. And so Putin began to concern himself, what could he do to reduce inflation? And he was led to believe, rightly or wrongly, that one of the steel companies was charging more for its steel within Russia, where there was a building boom, than what it was charging when it exported. This was a company called Mechtel. And so he called in the president, explain why there seems to be this discrepancy in prices. And the president of the company pleaded illness. He said, I'm in the hospital, I can't come. And Putin said, I don't believe you. I'll send out the Kremlin doctor to check you out to see what was happening. And immediately this brought back an echo of the Yukos affair. And so what happened is that the stock fell maybe 70, 80%. And it wasn't just that the stock of this company fell. When the case of Yukos, that was different. In the case of Mechtel, the stock fell, and this set off reverberations throughout the whole stock market. So the Russian stock market was subjected to this kind of thing in a way that preceded the worldwide collapse. Now, why is that? Well, that's an interesting question. Why is it, in other words, why is Putin's assault on Mechtel produce such different results than on Yukos? Well, in part because Russia has become now part of the globalized picture in a way that it wasn't earlier. One of Stalin's greatest contributions to the Soviet Union was he decided that the Soviet Union, should be kept immune from the business cycle manipulations, as he saw them, that would afflict the capitalist world periodically. Why should the Soviet Union be caught up in these things? And so he made the currency a non-convertible. The ruble was no longer convertible. He destroyed the stock market. He nationalized all industry and indeed introduced the 5-year plans, which were not affected by the depression of the 1930s. In fact, they benefited because there were jobs. They could hire the engineers from General Electric who were laid off. And Russia began to grow. And it began to grow unevenly, but still was an impressive rate of growth. But by the late 1970s, 1980s, Russia began to fall behind despite that. It fell behind in terms of quality. It fell behind in terms of innovation. The planning system did not lend itself to working in a high-technology world. The Soviet Union could not master the high technology that's associated with electronics, with biotechnology. It just couldn't do that kind of thing. And so, beginning with Gorbachev in particular, but enhanced by Yeltsin, and in particular by Putin, they began to involve themselves again with the globalized economy. One of Putin's greatest accomplishments was that he made Russia a member of the G8. This was one of the things he was proudest of. So Russia's part of the G8. And so now what happens is that when you start to go after Mechtel, you've got a lot of foreign capital that's gone into Russia. A lot of foreign capital that went into buying up the stock in Russian companies, of these energy companies in particular. And when they saw Putin harassing this executive, they said, we better get out of here because this may be another Yukos and we don't know where it's going to go. And so there was a panic and they moved out, which in a sense preceded the overall collapse of the stock market. And so it's caught up this way. Then on top of it, there was this trouble in Georgia. The Russians don't think it's an invasion. We think it's an invasion. Whatever it is, the confrontation in Georgia, which brought back images of the old Soviet Union, Russia as a bully. However it was, it certainly was a bully. What was cause and effect, you can argue, and the Russians, again, see it very differently than we do. But whatever it was again, something that frightened those who had put money into Russia. And so there was this capital flight of billions of dollars, which again caused this collapse. So the irony is now that maybe Stalin was right. Who would have thought that would have been the case? But there we are. So in the result now of the Mechtel thing, of the Georgian thing, and then the world globalization of the chaos and the panic in the outside world, the Russian stock market now has taken the biggest hit of any large industrial country. Iceland I don't count in this thing. The Russian stock market has fallen more than 70%. As bad as things are here, the Russian situation is much worse. And what has happened, of course, is that these oligarchs, both the original and the second, have been hurt correspondingly. And what has been happening is that, like most, like many people who are very wealthy, they were using the stock they had to borrow money so they could buy more stock and expand. So men like Deripaska, who's replaced Khodorkovsky as the richest man in Russia, had borrowed money to buy up stock in Magna, which is a Canadian company, automobile parts supplier, General Motors, and also a German contracting firm. And the bank, the price stock fell, the collateral fell, the bank called a loan, and he had to simply walk away from $200 million worth of investment. And so they are now, the oligarchs now, both the old and the new, are being hit this way, and the whole thing has turned around. But for Putin, it still is a very heady time, and at least until recently, we just had another one of our meetings in September, and he's still pretty strong, pretty assertive, and doesn't show any sign of lying awake night worrying about what's going to happen to the stock. But just how much things have changed. Just Russia is back, that's the message. And how much they've changed, I will leave you with a closing statement from Putin. This was a press conference that he held in June 2007. And I'll read you the transcript, the translated transcript. The correspondent from Der Spiegel says, "Mr. President, former federal chancellor Gerhard Schroeder called you a pure Democrat. Do you consider yourself as such?" And Putin, I'm reading now Putin's read, he laughs. "Am I a pure Democrat? Of course I am. Absolutely. But you know what the problem is? It's not even a problem, it's a real tragedy. The problem is that I'm all alone. The only one of my kind in the whole wide world." And now this, what he says, is correct. "Just look what's happening in North America. It's simply awful. Torture, homeless people, Guantanamo, people detained without trial and investigation. Just look at what's happening in Europe. Harsh treatment of demonstrators, rubber bullets and tear gas used first in one capital, then in another. Demonstrators killed in the streets." Well, you know, it's right, but look over your shoulder, man. I mean, you know. But anyway, that's beside the point. He ends that intervention with this: "There's no one to talk to since Mahatma Gandhi died." Well, you know, I mean, again, with this kind of feeling of we're there and I'm doing these things, and it's just an incredible turnaround, and there we are. So, now, are there questions?